The unwelcome guest. My decision to book an Airbnb for a solo weekend getaway seemed like a great idea at the time. The cozy cottage nestled in the woods promised solitude and serenity. Little did I know that this escape would spiral into a nightmarish encounter with the unknown. The Airbnb, a charming wooden cabin with a rustic charm, stood isolated from neighbouring homes. The host, an amiable woman named Mrs. Thornton, had left the keys under the doormat along with a note welcoming me. The first evening was peaceful. The crackling fireplace provided a warm glow, and the silence of the woods was a welcome escape from the hustle of city life. As night fell, a peculiar unease settled in the air. I tried to dismiss it, attributing the feeling to my overactive imagination. I decided to turn in early, hoping a good night's sleep would dispel the creeping sense of discomfort. At around midnight, a soft tapping echoed through the cabin. I jolted awake, convinced I had dreamt the sound, but it persisted. I traced the source to the window in the living room, where the tapping grew more insistent, as if someone or something was desperately trying to get my attention. Summoning my courage, I approached the window and peered outside. The moon cast an eerie glow, revealing a figure standing at the edge of the woods. It was a silhouette, indistinct and unnerving. I couldn't make out any features, but the tapping continued, now accompanied by a low, guttural moan that sent shivers down my spine. Uneasy and curious, I decided to confront the mysterious figure. I stepped outside, the chilly night air sending a shudder through me. The figure remained at the edge of the woods, still and silent. I called out, asking who they were and what they wanted. The only response was an unsettling silence. Returning to the cabin, I locked the door and tried to convince myself that it was just a local resident, or perhaps a wandering animal. As I settled back into bed, the tapping resumed, this time on the cabin walls. It seemed to encircle me, as if an unseen presence circled the entire structure. The atmosphere inside the cabin turned oppressive. Shadows danced on the walls, taking shapes that seemed to writhe and contort. I could hear faint whispers, unintelligible and haunting. Panic set in, and I fumbled for the keys, contemplating leaving this unsettling place. Just as I reached for the doorknob, the tapping and whispers ceased. The cabin plunged into a heavy silence. Reluctantly, I decided to stay, telling myself it was just a bizarre occurrence, perhaps a trick of the wind and my overactive imagination. The next morning, I tried to shake off the events of the night as I explored the quaint town nearby. The locals, however, seemed to avoid eye contact, their expressions filled with a mix of fear and pity. When I inquired about the history of the cabin, they exchanged hushed whispers, refusing to divulge any information. That night, the tapping and whispers returned with a vengeance. This time, the figure at the edge of the woods was closer, its form more defined but still obscured. The moans grew louder, more desperate, as if pleading for something I couldn't comprehend. Terrified, I packed my bags and left the cabin in the dead of night, never looking back. The unease that had settled in the air lifted as I drove away, but the memory of that Airbnb, with its tapping spectre and haunted whispers, would forever linger an unwelcome guest in the recesses of my mind. The haunting retreat. The Airbnb listing promised a secluded retreat, nestled deep in the woods, away from the hustle and bustle of the world. Desperate for a break from reality, I booked the cabin without a second thought. Little did I know that, The tranquility promised by the photos masked a darkness that lurked beneath the surface of this seemingly idyllic escape. As I drove down a winding, overgrown path, the forest canopy swallowed the sunlight, casting an ominous gloom over the surroundings. The cabin emerged from the shadows like a ghostly apparition, its time-worn exterior blending seamlessly with the ancient trees that stood sentinel round it. A shiver ran down my spine as I stepped inside, the door groaning on its rusty hinges. The interior was frozen in time, as if the cabin itself held its breath in anticipation. Antique furniture adorned the living room, covered in dusty sheets that whispered of neglect. A faded portrait hung on the wall, the eyes of the stern-faced figure in the painting following my every move. Unease settled over me like a heavy fog, but I brushed it off as a product of an overactive imagination. Night descended with an unsettling swiftness, the darkness outside the cabin impenetrable. One lit a few candles, their feeble flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. The forest beyond the windows seemed to come alive with mysterious murmurs, the rustle of unseen creatures amplifying my sense of isolation. As I settled into the creaking bed, an eerie silence enveloped the cabin. But then, from the depths of the woods, I heard a distant melody, a haunting tune that sent shivers down my spine. It echoed through the trees, growing louder with each passing moment. The air itself seemed to vibrate with an otherworldly energy. I ventured outside, drawn toward the ethereal music that hung in the night air. The moon cast an eerie glow on the clearing in front of the cabin, revealing a gathering of shadowy figures. Their faces were obscured, hidden beneath hooded cloaks that billowed in the night breeze. They swayed to the haunting melody, their movements synchronized in a macabre dance. Fear rooted me to the spot as the figures turned toward me, their eyes gleaming with an unnatural luminescence. The melody reached a crescendo, and the very ground beneath my feet seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. In the flickering candlelight, I could see symbols etched into the forest floor, arcane markings that spoke of rituals long forgotten. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. The figures advanced, their whispers weaving through the air like a dark incantation. Panic seized me as I sprinted back into the cabin, slamming the door shut behind me. The melody lingered, a haunting refrain that echoed in the recesses of my mind. The night grew colder, the walls of the cabin closing in with a suffocating intensity. I could hear the phantom footsteps of the cloaked figures outside, their presence an oppressive force that pressed against the fragile barrier of the cabin. Shadows danced on the walls, contorting into grotesque shapes that seemed to mock my feeble attempts at escape. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the haunting melody faded into an eerie silence. The figures vanished into the depths of the woods, leaving me alone in the aftermath of an otherworldly encounter. The AirBnb retreat, advertised as a haven from the chaos of the world, had become a portal to a realm where the boundary between the living and the supernatural blurred into a chilling dance of shadows and whispers. The guest that never checked out. My excitement was palpable as I unlocked the door to the quaint AirBnb cottage nestled deep in the woods. The online photos had promised a serene retreat, but as I crossed the threshold, an inexplicable chill wrapped around me like a spectral shroud. Dismissing it as nerves, I brushed aside the uneasy feeling, attributing it to the isolation of the location. The first night passed uneventfully, and I convinced myself that my unease was merely a byproduct of an overactive imagination. However, as the days unfolded, The quaintness of the cottage morphed into a haunting reminder of my increasing isolation. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ancient trees, I heard a soft whisper in the air. It was a name, barely audible, carried by the wind that rustled through the leaves. I strained to catch the words, but they eluded me, leaving only an unsettling sensation in their wake. That night, the cottage seemed to come alive with the echoes of unseen footsteps and distant laughter. I was certain I was alone, yet the air carried the weight of unseen guests. The walls, once a comforting barrier, now felt like a thin veil between me and a realm beyond my comprehension. Desperate for reassurance, I contacted the Airbnb host, hoping for a logical explanation. The response was prompt, but it brought no comfort. The host claimed that no one had booked the cottage for the dates I mentioned. My unease deepened as I realized I was entirely alone. In this isolated place, also I thought. The following night, a mysterious glow emanated from the attic, drawing me like a moth to a flame. Creaking stairs protested under my weight. As I ascended into the darkness, the attic, dimly lit by an otherworldly radiance, revealed an ancient guestbook. The pages, weathered and yellowed, documented the names of previous occupants, each one accompanied by a date. My eyes widened in horror as I recognized the name, whispered in the wind the name of the last recorded guest, who supposedly checked out years ago. The dates were in chronological order until the present day, where my own name awaited its inevitable entry. The realization struck me like a bolt of lightning. I was the next chapter in this haunting narrative. A cold breeze swept through the attic, extinguishing the feeble light. Panic set in. I stumbled back down the stairs, the darkness pressing in on me like a suffocating cloak. The cottage, once a haven, now felt like a labyrinth of forgotten stories, each one more chilling than the last. Sleep eluded me as the whispers grew louder, the unseen guests closing in. Shadows danced along the walls, morphing into ghostly figures that lingered at the periphery of my vision. The air thickened with a palpable malevolence, and I knew I was no longer alone. As dawn approached, I fled the cottage, leaving behind the ominous whispers and the ghostly apparitions. The Airbnb, once a promise of respite, now stood as a testament to the horrors that lurked in the shadows of seemingly ordinary places. The memory of that isolated cottage, and the spectral guests that never checked out, would forever haunt my nightmares. A chilling reminder that some horrors are not bound by time or reason.